Welcome everybody joining us in this session on MaaS and governance. My name is Geiske Bouma. I am a senior researcher and advisor at TNO, which is a Dutch research institute and a think tank in the field of urban mobility, planning, governance, transitions. And I will be your moderator today. And with me, I have some fantastic panelists today that I would shortly like to introduce. And you will be hearing more of them later, but then you have an idea who is here with us. So first of all, Laura Eilo, Program Director for the National Growth Program for the Transport Sector at ITS Finland. Previously, she also worked at the Ministry of Transport and Communications of Finland. So Laura, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, great to be here.
And then Eric Mink, Program Manager for the 7 national MaaS pilots in the Netherlands, working at the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management. Eric, welcome.
Thank you.
And Jarvis Murray, who works within the LADOT as a principal in charge of policies, regulations, and enforcement related to for-hire transportation modes and other programs within the area of LA. Welcome, Jarvis.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
And then finally, Diana Vonk Noordegraaf, who is the portfolio lead within TNO for New Mobility. She works in the field of new mobility, mobility as a service, mobility policy, and cooperative automated driving. Happy to have you all here today.
Thank you, Geiske.
We're going to kick off this session with a presentation. TNO did research in the field of MaaS and governance, an international case study analysis, and we'd like to share some of that content with you first. And then after that, we'll have a discussion together with our panelists on those outcomes and some topics that we feel are interested to dive in a bit more deeper. So let's start the presentation, and Diana, then I'll give you the floor to start.
Okay, Geiske, thank you very much. Good day, everybody, and I would say good evening to my fellow Europeans. I would like to tell you something about the study that we did on MaaS and governance. And I'd love to give you a brief summary of that before we dive into the discussion with the panelists. So first, I'd like to tell you something about the study that we did on MaaS and governance. We were asked by the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management, Eric Mink, to do a very interesting study into 6 comparable cases. And we looked at 6 international locations at roughly the same scale of the Netherlands. The LA metropolitan area, the city-state of Singapore, they're roughly the same size of the Netherlands. And we looked into how is governance organized there. And what we did is we made a governance framework to define what governance is, and then applied that to the cases and did some analysis on that. And what we hope to achieve today is to really facilitate international learning and exchange also through this session. And we would love to share with you the lessons learned. And although we really focused on MaaS and MaaS initiatives, and we mainly focused on the perspective of the public authorities, we do think it's also relevant for a wider audience that's working in MaaS. So here you see our governance framework. And like I said, we started off with the detailing out like what is governance, because we really think that well, it starts with the strategy and approach, but that can cover a wide range of aspects. So you have to look at the goals, motivations, and desired outcomes. You look at institutions, the stakeholders, the market structure. So how is the MaaS service organized and what are the characteristics? So it can also be organized by public organizations, private organizations, or a public-private partnership. And of course, policy and steering is an important part of governance. And at the bottom of the framework, you see the contextual factors, and that's actually very important because it's the context, the culture of a specific location that really defines what the ingredients are, how the ecosystem looks like, and of course the timing, because every country, every city, every region is in a different phase of development and also has their own unique drivers and barriers. So we found that context is very important. From our analysis of the 6 cases, we defined those key MaaS ingredients, and I think they give a very good perspective on how we look at MaaS. So that's also why we wanted to share it with you. We think that MaaS, first of all, consists of the wheels on the ground. So what are the new mobility options that are out there, from scooters to shared bikes to shared cars? And we really think that public transportation, or as you call it, transit, should be the backbone of a system. It should be a very important ingredient to work with. And that's also, well, what we found in many of the cases. Of course, when you talk about MaaS, you talk also about different levels of integration and how you integrate the services via a MaaS platform. Many discussions also in Urbanism Next are around data, and that's very important. You need data standards, but also you need data sharing. So sharing between MaaS service providers and public authorities, because most public authorities really want to steer towards societal goals. MaaS is a means to an end. You want to achieve certain goals, so you need to know which goals do I focus on. And another element of steering towards societal goals is that you know what's going on and what helps and what doesn't help. So you need monitoring and evaluation to have that insights. And last but not least, of course, the uptake. You want to know the use of the MaaS services by the consumers. So those are the key MaaS ingredients that we found in this study. Now I'd like to share with you some highlights of the 6 cases that we have looked into, so that you have a general idea about what are the different cases and what are the unique characteristics of those. And after that, I will show you some of the results of the study. First of all, we looked into Austria. Most of the people in the audience might know it from Vienna and the Vienna region, but we looked at Austria as the entire country and what's going on there. And what we saw is that the national government was very actively organizing the MaaS ecosystem, but that changed after the change of governments in 2019. Austria is still very active in MaaS, but they changed their strategy and they're really focused now on the public transportation provider, mainly in the rail sector, and to organize integrated ticketing. Before the change of government, you saw a broad scope of activities, funding pilots, collaborations, and now the focus is more on the public transportation provider. And that's also the party that offers the MaaS platform. In Île-de-France, which is the Paris region in France, you see that the regional transport authority is the person in the lead of MaaS. And they're highly involved in many research and development projects, do a lot about stimulating innovation in this area. And what's interesting is that they have developed and facilitate their own MaaS platform. So it's the regional transport authority that is in charge of that. And you see a lot of collaboration between public and private partners. Then we go to Finland. Interesting is that they have a large overarching mobility strategy. Some people might also know that Finland has changed their legislation in order to facilitate MaaS and new players to enter the market. Also here you see a lot of public-private cooperation, and the MaaS apps are mainly offered by private players. Then if we go to the USA, LA region, of course, one of the key highlights is the focus that they have on data and formulating data standards and data and sharing standards. they have an open market structure with low barriers to entry. So there's a lot of experimentation on the ground with all the, in practice with a lot of private players that can pilot and pivot all kinds of services. And in the LA region, they're also thinking about what could be the right incentive structure so that we can really start steering towards MaaS. And then if we go to Singapore, there is not really a specific regulation on MaaS, which I think is interesting, but also quite explainable if you look into that. They have a large overarching mobility plan, and they really see MaaS as just a vehicle to perhaps enforce their larger strategy, which is having public transportation as a backbone and steering towards a car-light society. And if MaaS helps in that, that is great, but MaaS itself doesn't have a specific strategy. Then we come to the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, a lot of interesting pilots are going on. There are 7 scalable pilots that intend to be scaled up to a national level as part of a national MaaS program by the national government. And there's a lot of effort in building public-private partnerships in ensuring a fair level playing field, data sharing and data standards. And what is quite unique is the attention for learning. They have set up a learning and knowledge and learning environment to facilitate the learning process among public and private players. I already said it before, context is of tremendous importance. And I think this graph shows the mobility options that are out there in the different cases. Well, and of course you see that in LA, for example, the TNCs and scooters are highly present. And if you then compare it to the Netherlands, you see, for example, that scooters are not even allowed. We're one of the exemptions in Europe where that's not the case. You also see, for example, that bike share is highly present, which is, I think, interesting because, well, we are known for biking. And a lot of Dutch people even have more than one bike. But even in such a context, shared biking is also used a lot and is available in many places. So if we then look into the results and really, for example, focus on the strategy and approach that has been chosen in the different cases, then the first element that we found very interesting is how it's organized. So in Austria, in LA, and in Singapore, you really see that the primary action is along the individual modes, so along the verticals, you could say. And that's quite a contrast with Finland, Île-de-France, and the Netherlands, where the focus is really along the integration of modes. And another interesting difference is, for example, about the market strategy. In Austria, Finland, Île-de-France, and the Netherlands, you really see that it is about supporting the deployment of the different mobility options, whereas in Los Angeles and Singapore, it's about shaping the deployment of already existing mobility options. Well, then we go to the societal goals. If, as a public authority, you want to steer towards societal goals, of course, it's interesting to define which societal goals are important. So this picture gives an overview of the societal goals that are of key importance in the different cases. And what you can also see is that in some cases, there are specific goals that get more attention than in other cases. So in Finland, a specific goal was also to promote the Finnish companies, in which they, I think, very well succeeded. And like I said, in the Netherlands, enhancing learning is also an important goal. Then we'd like to share something with you on the ecosystem. So if you look at the actor role, so what is done by public parties, what is done by private parties, how is it organized, then you also see some interesting differences. So in Finland, Los Angeles, and Singapore, you see that the private actor leads and the public actor sets the regulations and the settings. In Île-de-France in the Netherlands, it's really about public-private cooperation, and the public actor coordinates. And in Austria, you see that the public transportation company is in the lead and that the public actor steers towards that. And then if we go to the bottom part of the slide, you can see that there's also quite a difference in which actor provides the MaaS app to the consumers. In Finland, Singapore, and Los Angeles, you see that the private sector provides that app, and is the MaaS service provider. In the Netherlands, that is actually done by a corporation of private companies who offer different kind of MaaS apps. And Île-de-France and Los Angeles, it's a regional transport authority that offers a MaaS app. And in Austria, you also see that it is the public transport company. So there are many different ways on how you can shape a MaaS ecosystem. This is an overview of the different policy instruments that are applied in cases. I find it very relevant picture because it shows that there are many different categories of policy instruments, and it only shows the main categories, but behind each category there is actually a wide range of different tools and levers that can be applied in a different phases of MaaS development and steering towards societal goals. And you can see that already in many cases there is a wide range of options used. And often when I talk to cities, they ask me like, okay, should I think about changing my regulation or putting new regulation in place? And then I show this picture and I say, well, look at all the options that you have. I think that you should take an as broad as very broad view and try to use as many tools as you need to be able to achieve your goals. So hopefully our study can give some inspiration on this aspect as well. Well, to conclude, I would like to share with you our main lessons learned. We really found that MaaS is really in the early stages of development. So although we have been working on a topic for several years, there's so much more ground to cover and there's so many more things to learn. And we also learned that MaaS really requires a tailor-made strategy. It really depends on your the local context and the goals that you want to achieve. So if you look at Singapore and they want to have public transportation as a backbone and then MaaS helping towards that, that requires a completely different strategy than, for example, in the Netherlands, where we really want to learn how MaaS can contribute to steering towards societal goals and do that in a public-private cooperation. Then if you look at the public-private partnerships, we really found that that was actually a thing that was crucial in each context. So we really think that although there are many different flavors on how to shape a public-private partnership, that would be eventually be where all cases move towards. We also see that the involvement of public authorities is really important, particularly if you want to start steering towards societal goals. It's not that you have to have standards and that you're done. There's so much more that the public authority can take up as a role. And we do think that monitoring and evaluation and finding out what is going on and how can you use that knowledge to take the next step is something that needs more attention. So then in the MaaS outlook, we really think that the development of the MaaS ecosystem really requires dedication, long-term commitment, and also some patience. And we should really recommend to further enforce the knowledge base for MaaS. So I hope that you guys will also join in the discussion and that we can jointly work towards that enhancement of the knowledge base by this session as well. Thank you very much.
So thanks, Diana, for kicking off. Well, lots of content for us to further discuss. I saw a question in the chat if we can share the presentation. Yes, we will. And Diana, maybe it's also an idea to share the link of the research to the report if people are interested lots and lots of more content behind it. So if you're interested, we'd like to refer to that. But now to the discussion. And when we talked to each other as a preparation, well, we already filled the hour. So it was a difficult choice to find out what we were going to talk about. Well, the choice was made. So there are some topics that we will discuss further. We will get to policy instruments a bit more, and we will also get to those societal goals a bit more, but we will start with maybe a kind of a triggering way of looking at this, this MaaS and governance. And Eric Mink, I think you said, is it evolution or is it a revolution? Can you share some ideas about how you explore the future and what you think the role is that different parties should take in this? And then Laura and Jarvis, please join in if you feel you would like to add to that. But Eric, could you kick off that that triggering sentence?
Yes, thank you, Geiske. Yeah, I started working on MaaS for about 4 years ago, and at that time, all the private parties tried to convince me that that MaaS was solving all the problems for government, and that they only needed a little help, but it already existed, and they didn't need regulation. What we've seen in the Netherlands is that MaaS is too complex to leave up just to the market. There are so many transport providers. There are so many interdependencies. And as we have seen in other platform economies, external effects are not just positive. There are negative external effects as well, certainly if big investments are involved. So our approach is one of a step-by-step approach by finding out how this market will work. And although I was hoping for a revolution for fixing the mobility market by using apps, we now see that it is really a matter of step-by-step evolution rather than revolution. And when it comes to regulation, I also think it's a step-by-step approach. You shouldn't move too quick, but not be lazy either, because we don't know where it's going. We need to be flexible. Market is developing, and governments and governance and regulation should develop accordingly, but not kill the creativity of the market, because in that case, we would stick with the old incumbents rather than have the innovations that could enhance the societal goals that are so essential in public policy for mobility as well.
Great, thanks for kicking that off. So Laura, listening to this story of Eric's and mentioning innovation and changing regulations, so that's something you did in Finland. How did you go from there? Can you say something more about, well, maybe your evolutionary step-by-step approach, or did you need a revolution to start the evolution? What's your view on that?
Well, I quite agree. It's an evolution to a revolution, but I still believe that MaaS will be one of the revolutionary things in mobility sector. And I actually like to see MaaS as a broader transport system 2.0 instead of using apps, and we really have to think of the whole transport system in a holistic way. But indeed, this has been a very, very long process in Finland as well. Personally, I've been working with MaaS, I would say around 13 years already, and it has been developing the whole that time. So the first 2-3 years, we were developing the sort of policy context and considering on how to have a more user-centric system that would contribute to the societal goals. Then it took a couple of years to change the legislation, where the essential ideas were to force to operators to release certain essential data in a machine-readable form, and on the other hand, open up of APIs into ticketing systems so that ensures the integration of different modes. And now we have been implementing the legislation for almost 4 years. And of course, we learn all the time. And actually, that was one of the reasons we decided to go for a framework legislation so that it is not too restrictive, but on the other hand, that means that there needs to be a loads of PPP collaboration and platforms for the discussion and guidance, lower level, also information for the actors on how to go forward with implementation, and also contracts between different parties. So yes, an evolution towards a revolution, I would say.
So Jarvis, you are actually also very much involved in regulation and enforcement. How would you describe your way of working? Do you also feel that there's an evolution to a revolution? And well, you in the preparation, you also talked about the piloting and the pivoting and the adaptiveness that you're trying to take in. Be great if you could share something about that.
Yeah, so actually, as we develop regulations and as new modes come in, you know, there is a certain level of, you have to kind of almost assert authority initially, but even with that assertion, we try to take a light touch in the regulation so that we do want to be able to pivot if they pivot, because what we do see a lot of, and particularly for these newer modes, is that there's no true business plan. They kind of have an idea, they've gotten some funding and they go. You know, and they all absolutely believe that they're going to change everything. And then 3 months in, you know, they're pivoting in terms of, you know, oh, now we have to make money. The shareholders are asking for X, Y, and Z, and they have to adjust. And so we try to adjust with them. But with that being said, we're still also trying to maintain, you know, they're competitive companies. They want to make a profit. They want to do those things, but we're trying to protect public safety and equity and ensure access for everyone. So these are the challenges that we have legislatively. We pilot a lot because it does take time to do legislation. And so we try to take what we've learned and bake it into legislation as we go. But oftentimes what we don't want to do, because we simply don't always have the time, is to sit down and craft the right legislation first and then begin. We often have to kind of do kind of a, you know, a short model and then expand as the program grows and as we learn more. So that's how we've been doing a lot of things here in Los Angeles.
Thanks. And Eric, so you are running those 7 national MaaS pilots now. And what kind of legislation do you have in place, or are you still thinking about putting legislation in place, or is it still to be seen? What's your vision on that?
Well, currently we don't have any legislation at all, but we started out 7 national pilots for 17 million people. Private parties could get a subsidy if they started such pilots. But in exchange for these subsidies, we formulated some principles in a framework agreement, and these principles are for example, that they share their data to a learning environment, that they cooperate, that they use certain standards, and that they will make as much transport operators available as possible. And based on the experience with these temporary principles, we see what works and what doesn't. And if it works, we will put it into legislation. And if it doesn't work, or if it needs some adaptation, then we will probably put it into force as well, but slightly adapted.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting to see what will happen in the next 6 months, because the pilots have a term of 2 years. So after these 2 years, we certainly need some legislation in place, otherwise we won't get any data anymore. And we can't optimize or whatever. So you could see it like a trial and error approach. My minister gave me a license to fail, so I'm safe.
So how about Laura or Jarvis, the possibility to fail? How's that something that you've been coping with? It all sounds fantastic, right? You try something, it doesn't work, and you move on to the next, but too many failures, that's also not what you're looking for. But how do you communicate and organize such a way of working? Who wants to have a go?
Well, I can start. Of course, to avoid too much of failing, I would say that stakeholder hearings and very strong collaboration in the drafting phase are super important. But I have to admit that there has been already many changes to the Finnish legislation since it was published. So we have learned there have been, it's more about a minor details, but those have been fixed whilst we have found them. So I think the overall policy environment is quite understanding that when we are dealing with new issues, then in some cases you cannot do it 100% right at the first time.
And so for the people that don't know how you are working on this in Finland, can you give an example of something that you've learned, that you've changed from how it was in the start and how it is now?
Actually, it has been more on the market access side. So when we first did the legislative reform, we relaxed a lot the taxi market regulation, which was super tight in Finland, and it's more about nuances in that. So we have increased since some legislation when it comes to the requirements for taxi market operators. On the data side, it's been actually quite good. But what we have learned since is that there are many details that need to be agreed between different parties, and they need support in that. Especially also PTAs need support, but also MaaS operators and smaller companies. And there, the Finnish Transport and Communications Agency has been doing a lot of work to have different platforms to discuss API requirements or recommendations for the certain sets of agreements, etc.
So Jarvis, how are you taking up this public-private cooperation, and how have you maybe changed things over time, or lessons that you'd like to share with us?
Well, first I do want to say, great job, Laura, on the taxi thing, because taxis are a legacy mode, and they are really difficult to make any changes to. And as someone who's worked in the taxi world for quite some time, it is so hard because they're so highly regulated. And just to make simple changes, you have drivers and companies and the public. There's so many different pieces that you have to put together. So So it's very difficult to make that move. So great job, Laura. But in terms of what we've learned, for instance, in the scooter department, we've had some failures. We had a program that we thought would enhance equity based upon certain zones, right? And we put those zones together and we, informed the scooter companies. We actually offered discounts for operating in those areas and things of that nature. And we hoped that the market would drive service to those areas. And it didn't happen. So we still had no service. Even with the discounts, they were like, oh, that sounds great. And it never happened. So we had to pivot. And that's really kind of the key. You don't want to, if something's not working, you don't want to just double down and keep pushing. You want to kind of take a step back and go, well, we thought that was a good idea, but maybe we need to adjust and do something different. So now, we're having to force service a little bit more in those areas, but we also changed how we defined the areas, and we focused, because initially we had a geography and we didn't really take into consideration, the active network of that geography. Whereas now we are looking at the geography for the scooters and saying, okay, we're using this area because this area has some infrastructure that's a little bit more safe for riding versus the other areas we may have been pushing that were not safe for riding, which is one of the reasons they didn't want to deploy there, along with it not being economically, a hot area for them.
Yeah.
So we tried to change that focus, and we're still in that phase of making that change. They're going to begin doing it in April, but those are the kind of things that we've had to do as you learn from some of those mistakes. So you do have a little bit of a leash for failure, but not too much, I think, because at some point, whether it's the politicians, your government, your council, the public, as well as your private providers and the users, you're too much of that, and they're going to say, we need someone else to do this.
Yes.
So
Eric?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting discussion, because I think what the report of TNO showed me is that we all started from different starting points. We all have different markets in place. We all have different regulations in place, and that there are differences with regards to competition law, with regards to taxi legislation, data legislation, the kind of regulation for public transport operators. So your study, your report showed me that there really isn't a one-size-fits-all approach for this problem, or for governance or mobility as a service yet. But what I think that I see along all these cases that you've studied is that neither a full public, neither a full private approach will stand. I think we have all been starting or moving towards public-private governance models, and I don't think one of these models anywhere is finalized yet. But I think I see a movement towards more public-private new ecosystems evolving. And how to govern that is something I'm still, well, in Dutch we say, breaking my head on. I'm not sure whether anyone understands what I'm saying right now, but it's
well, it's somewhat disappointing. Yeah. You could say it's disappointing that there's no one size fits all. There's no blueprint. Like if you use this governance model, you'll have success for sure, because these contexts are so different. And that's what I also really liked about the research we did, is that we really dove into those contexts. And I think what Diana described in her presentation as the key ingredients of MaaS, if you look into our report, those key ingredients are totally different in every case study. And there are different approaches used. So in that sense, I think there's also different ways of steering. And I think, Laura, you mentioned like, okay, we can talk a lot about legislation, but there are different ways of steering towards your societal goals in the end. So if we dive into that a bit more, because we can try to put everything in legislation, but the way you have all been giving your examples, it's also moving a bit with the river, so to say, to see where it flows and where it goes and what fits and what doesn't, and then doing the pivot part. So Laura, do you have any examples of other kinds of steering, or is it still a challenge that you're in the middle of?
It of course is a challenge as well, but still there are some ideas. So like it was said, the Finnish transport market legislation is mostly about level playing field to market access, and then data sharing and interoperability. But of course, we have to see the mobility sector in the context of other policy areas. And one of the most crucial things is taxation policies and incentives that really steer the behavior and encourage the use of sustainable modes. And that is actually something we are doing at the moment in Finland. So there will be a report on the proposal to renew the transport taxation totally. Other thing would be land use planning and infrastructure planning. So of course, if you build highways, you will get more cars, and vice versa if you build more infrastructure for sustainable modes. And in Finland, for us, it's very important to have public transit as the backbone of MaaS. So of course, even though if you are promoting new mobility services, you also need to promote public transit, and it's about the integration of those to compete with the private car. Also city level policies. I would say that Antwerp is quite a good example what you can do also without legislation nationally, and that's more flexible and add parking policies, etc. And performance management KPIs in different organizations. But I think what is most important is that in each organization there is a real ownership for MaaS. I would say that the Dutch approach is a great example in that sense, that Eric really has the ownership for all the pilot program. If you divide the responsibilities, there is no one person who really is steering the development. And I would say this applies to ministries, agencies, also PTAs, that somebody has to have the continuous ownership.
But then what do you mean with ownership? Because, well, when we looked at the presentation of Diana, it's ownership of coordinating things, ownership of the app, ownership. So what, in your view, is that ownership?
It's more about ownership of coordination and developing. So I definitely would like to see that there are private sector apps, but the integration is done with the public transit. I firmly believe that private sector is the best placed to innovate and develop services in a user-centric manner, but it's about cooperation. And when talking about ownership, I mean that in every organization there should be somebody who is really firmly committing to the PPP collaboration and trying to find the ways forward for a common good.
So Jarvis, how's that on your side? Because there are quite some market parties that entered cities and regions, and then you got stuck with them in the sense of, okay, but how can we make use of these offerings, but how can it also gear towards what we're looking for? How do you see that coordination and development and ownership in your case?
Well, I think, for us, I mean, I work as part of the regulatory agency, and we manage the regulations, and oftentimes through private entities, regulation is a dirty word, and it's not the first thing that any of them want to hear. However, we try to think of regulation, again, we're here to protect public safety, and we're here to protect the right of way and access for all. But the other part of it is we try to partner with these entities. So we recognize that they have a business to run. And that's how we look at the partnership. You know, when we're trying to make regulations, I don't just kind of do it in a dark room and then drop a ton of regulations on you. I'll often, you know, uh, iterate what I'm thinking, you know, and have roundtables with the operators, you know, and just go through, hey, here's what I'm trying to achieve. Here's what I want to do, you know, and I'm open to ideas from you. And we don't agree on everything, don't get me wrong, but, you know, if you make them a part of the solution, then the regulation tends to go a little bit easier because they at least have an understanding of what you're doing versus this idea that you're just dropping all these burdens on us because you want to collect city revenue or you want to stifle our innovation or whatever they think it may be. And the opposite is true. You know, if you have a great service that's usable and can take cars off the road or expand first mile, last mile, what we want to do is encourage that, but we need some parameters, you know, and that's really the goal. Hey, here are the parameters I want to set, but what are the things that'll be helpful for your business, and what are the things we can help, you know, you can help to get you there. So that's definitely how we look at it.
If I look at one of the questions in the Q&A, it's also about how far do you go in proposing, for instance, regulation and steering, and how to prevent from negatively influencing any developments and innovation. Do you have any experiences with that, Jarvis? How do you balance that?
Yeah, well, so it's never perfect. So that's the first thing I do want to say. And you don't always know. So a lot of that balance really is, again, talking to the providers, talking to the people who actually do the work, and try to get an understanding of how their business operates and what might be best. And then that way you can kind of take baby steps in terms of moving forward with new things. Because, you know, again, as much as we would love, you know, mobility as a service to be united, you know, we're not there, and so we're having to kind of set the framework to help get us there. And so, you know, with scooters we start with data sharing, right? And here are the things that we're going to require to help us manage the right of way, because we have over 20,000 of these devices on the roadway, and I can't have 20,000 people out there looking at each scooter to make sure everything's fine. I have to manage it through data. But then even as we do that, now I have to go to my legacy businesses, i.e. taxis, and say, hey, you've already been sending us data for 1,000 years. You know, for the last 100 years, we've received data from you, but we're going to start doing it a little differently and manage the right of way differently. And, you know, eventually we can get everyone onto at least the data platform. And then we can begin having that discussion about unifying how we send out our message, or unifying how we manage the right of way, whether it's through dwell times or zone management or parking management. Eventually we want to get to that space, but we almost have to go kind of like mode by mode, and you know, what's the state machine that we need for each mode? What are the things that we care about for each mode? What's the data that we actually want to collect for each mode? And they're all slightly different. So
how do you see that, Eric? Because we don't necessarily organize the pilots in the Netherlands through single modes, but it's really integrated. So do you think there's a different approach to that?
No, I don't think so. I think, of course, mobility is very siloed across the world. But what mobility as a service showed to us was that we started out talking with mobility service providers, or mobility as a service providers. And these are, well, they are starting in a new market, and we had very open discussions. And bringing MaaS more forward, transport operators became interesting to talk with us as well. And that started, of course, with bike sharing and car sharing companies, and then all the public transport operators and taxi operators thought, well, that Eric is talking to them, but he's not talking to us. We want to have a seat at that table as well. And I love the fact that Jarvis has has experience with taxis. I spent more than 10 years working on public transport. But the fact that they see that open discussions are possible and they are not at the table makes them wonder, why am I not at the table? So I think that this approach might end up in a less siloed system, maybe thanks to the fact that mobility as a service is not about silos, but is about integration, interoperability, and collaboration. And in the end, openness. And this is a very, very optimistic view. I have my pessimistic days, but looking at the developments in the past 3 or 4 years, not just in the Netherlands, I think it really helps.
So maybe if we can be even more optimistic and look at the societal goals that we're really wanting to achieve. I'm very curious to know from you. So we're talking about this collaboration. We're talking about interacting with all the stakeholders, learning from each other, listening to each other, seeing what's needed and how we can help each other to achieve those goals that we're really striving for. So I'd like to know more about how do you organize that collaboration, and are there any examples of how that works best? And how do you discuss topics? For instance, Jarvis, you mentioned, well, the equity is really still a challenge to, in the beginning already, you said, well, we're starting now with, I think, pilots in April, you mentioned, to see how we can get that organized better than we did in the first go, because it didn't work how we thought the zoning would go. So how do you do that interaction and iteration when you're looking at your societal goals? How do you work on that, Jarvis?
Well, and admittedly, we're still experimenting because, you know, there's no right answer. And no matter what we do, there's always going to be someone who's telling you you're doing it wrong, you should be fired. But, you know, for us, like equity is a good example. And with the scooters specifically, one of the things that, you know, we can force service, incentivize service, force deployment, X, Y, Z. But Los Angeles, you know, the city alone is 500 square miles. And, you know, the county is like 4,000 square miles, right? So, you know, what we've learned is that each area has different needs and wants in terms of what access means to them. So one of the requirements that we're making on the companies is that they have to partner with a community-based organization. So, you know, we're giving them kind of open reign to do that, but they're going to have to do that, and we're going to have to monitor that collaboration, and then check in with the community-based organization and say, what are the things that you're looking for? What are the things that you need for this area? Because what I need in South LA is so different than what I need in the Valley. And so each of those organizations are going to be able to come forward and say, well, here are the things that matter most to us. And then I could actually put together a program that fits what the Valley needs and what the West Side needs, and then what South LA needs. It may be the same, but my guess is it's actually going to be slightly different. And we're gonna bring, again, the companies into this. Your partners in this. You have to help us make this work. And so we can help set the tone, set the stage, but they are going to have to be working directly with those organizations to find out, do I need low income programs? Do I need better access here? Do I need to work with a business, you know, 200 employees here, maybe we need to do special discounts for this hospital, you know, totally different things like that. But we're going to have to force that to happen. Don't know if it'll work, but that's what we plan to do.
And it's great that you're making an effort to really monitor and evaluate that. Like, is the effort in each area really contributing to those societal goals? And I think that is a fundamental step towards really steering towards your societal goals, because you need to know what's going on and if it really helps for what you're trying to achieve. And I think that is one of the things that can really be enforced and further developed. If you look at all the MaaS cases worldwide, I think we're just at the starting point of learning, like, what's going on, how does this work, and how can we really use MaaS as a means to an end. And so I really like what you're doing, Jarvis, to get that going.
So can you say something about how you organize that monitoring part? So do you work with certain KPIs? Is that something that you do for the whole area of LA? And then you also pivot towards how these different communities are taking that up? What's the way of working that you use there?
It's going to take a lot of work, but really the idea is, one, we're letting the operators kind of choose, the organization they work with. I mean, we're going to vet the organization, and obviously we'll go to the council district and, determine, hey, for the people that monitor that district, is this a viable organization? Is this, or is it just, because we've also had organizations with the companies have organized themselves and said, hey, here's our community organization. But that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for something that's been there a long time, more grassroots in nature, and working with those directly. And then, oh, go ahead.
So to jump in, because there's a question if these community-based organizations also represent groups like older adults or people with disabilities. So is it really inclusive the way you look at communities?
Well, we hope that it is, and that's something that we do care about greatly. So on the scooter side, that's an important element because our scooters block our sidewalks quite a bit. And so many of our complaints really relate to people not being able to pass, depending on if the sidewalk is too small. So we're hoping that they're going to be a part of these, part of the organizations. And if everyone comes back to us and none of them have chosen one of those, then we may have to reach out on our own to bring them in, because they're a big part of our taxi world, because our taxis do a lot of work for our elderly and disabled customers. So it's not like they don't exist. They're a big part of our city, and they're a big part of the money for our taxi businesses now. They're not a big part of the scooter business, but the scooter impacts are heavier on that population. So we do have to try to manage that through.
Yeah, so time has really flown by because we're already at our cue of 9 o'clock. So many things that we'd like to follow up on and talk about further. So maybe we can go on with all the work that we've been doing, and maybe at the Urbanism Next Portland next year, we can say something about the pilots you've been doing, Jarvis, and Eric, maybe learn something about what inputs you have got from the pilots. And Laura, also curious to know how things are progressing in Finland, and if you have really found those other steering mechanisms, and maybe have the feeling that you found kind of a mix of instruments, because I think that's one of the questions that we also feel is still at the table. What mix of instruments works for specific contexts, and what button should you push to steer things towards those societal goals? So I'm going to wrap up this session. I really want to thank our panelists and our speakers and presenters of this session. Thanks for being with us, also to the attendees and asking the questions. And we hope that the people that were attending learned a lot. And if you want to know more, do read the report. And if that leaves you with any questions, we at TNO are always willing to answer those, and also interested in other examples. Like we said, we hope this starts the discussion of learning. So we are not finished yet. Thank you all. And I wish you a great day, and for the Europeans, a nice evening.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.